My guest today is Bjørn Godøy, and I'm going to try to say it in Norwegian and then try to translate the title of the book, which I'm holding up in front of me here. It's called Occupert, en oppdatert historie om andre verdenskrig i Norge. And the English translation would be Occupied and Updated History about the Second World War in Norway. And as always, I of course have to ask, what inspired you to write this book?
The war in Norway, the occupation, is a huge historical issue, a lot of interest about it, a lot of books coming out every year. But curiously enough, there hadn't been a comprehensive single volume book about the war written in about 30 years, actually, since 1990. So me and the publisher, we thought it was about time that we could gather all the new insight, the new research that has been done since the early 90s. There's been a new generation of historians, not the least, and present that in a readable, it's not an academic book, but a book that aims to make this history available, accessible to a wider audience. And there just wasn't any, that kind of book was simply lacking in the book market. So that's why we wanted to do it. And it's, of course, the war, when you grow up in Norway, it's an ever-present kind of backdrop to your national identity as a Norwegian. So personally too, I have interest in the war history. It's an intriguing topic to go into.
Right, and of course, Norway was really supposed to be neutral, wasn't it? Before Hitler claimed, as we are going to discuss briefly, that the British occupation was against Norwegian neutrality. So that's quite, I find it fascinating as well.
Yeah, it was Norway, along with the other Scandinavian countries, had at the time in 1940 been neutral for long. I mean, Denmark had a brief war with Prussia in the mid 19th century, 1850s, somewhere around there.
1864, I think.
Yeah, 1864. Yeah, when they lost Schleswig-Holstein. But more recently, First World War, all the three Scandinavian nations were neutral, and it served them well. In Norway, it's a part of Norwegian history that Norway has since the wars in the late 1700s, the American Independence War, and so on. Norway has made quite a bit of money on staying neutral, but selling to the war parties, either through shipping or through timber and so on. And they did this in the First World War with, at least during the first 2 years, with a great amount of success. And there's also this attitude that small countries, this was a big topic in the interwar years, small countries could really do nothing to influence the big powers. The best thing they could hope for was to stay neutral, stay out of the conflicts.
So well, that happened with Belgium in the First World War.
Yeah, Belgium in the First World War is actually very relevant to the Norwegian situation in 1940. You could also say Czechoslovakia. In the Munich Agreement was handed down on a small nation. Czechoslovakia was never given a place at the table in Munich. And in Norway, the attitude was that if we get involved in the war, the same thing will happen to us. So the best we can hope for is to stay neutral. And of course, Hitler had no plan to take Norway. He didn't see it as, he didn't consider it necessary to take Norway. He thought Norway would stay fairly friendly towards Germany because, of course, he had a racialist understanding of the world, and the Germanic races would naturally bond together. He also thought that England would stay friendly to Germany, and he was surprised when that turned out not to be the case in 1939. So. Although Norway planned to stay neutral, this was a war as all wars, of course, things happen on the spot, but more so in the war against Nazis, which had I mean, Hitler was in the extreme given towards improvisation. He thought he could just improvise himself out of everything. So when the need arose that, yeah, maybe we should take Norway after all, he was very, he was inclined to do so on the spur of the moment and on very short notice. So.
No, it was as a matter of fact Quisling who we talked about as well, and there's a very good, and now it's keep in mind it's Norwegian podcast, but it's called Quisling is Perfect, but he was the one talking about his history, which will be an episode in itself. But well, it was he that, as a matter of fact, talked to Hitler about wanting that Norway might be a good idea to occupy for the Nazis. Right?
Yeah, a good idea. Yeah, he convinced Hitler that Germany had to take Norway. And of course, Quisling being one of the most hated men in Norwegian history and being a very, very idiosyncratic political thinker, a weird guy in many respects, his analysis was not necessarily wrong. The Allies, what he told Hitler is that England, the Allies, they will take Norway. And when that happens, you will lose access to this crucial resource, iron ore from Kiruna. Without iron ore from Kiruna, the German armament industry would just collapse fairly shortly. I mean, the ironworks in the Ruhr area, they would not have the the resources, the natural resources to continue building cannons, and, guns, and ships, and all this kind of stuff. This is a part of Quisling's analysis that was correct. It has been shown after the war in more recent studies that the Allies, England and France, and this was taking place in collaboration with Poland, they did indeed have very clear plans to go into Norway. This was at the time the Soviet Union was attacking Finland. This is a very important premise for the German invasion of Norway, which often disappears because the winter war in Finland, it finished before the Germans attacked Norway. But that is the backdrop to the whole geopolitical situation. England and France thought they had to go through Norway in order to stop or assist the Finnish against the Soviet Union, and they had clear plans on this, and they were planning to do it. And the soldiers were in their ships, ready to be shipped across the North Sea to Norway when the ceasefire in Finland occurred. So they had to go back on shore. Actually, it was that close. And if that had happened, England would have gone on shore in Norway somewhere in northern Norway and marched through northern Sweden, and Hitler's nightmare would have become a reality, that he would be cut off from the iron ore in Sweden. And if that happened, he could simply not have gone through with the war plans, to get vengeance for the Versailles Treaty and all this kind of stuff, moving into Western Europe and later on into the Soviet Union. So Quisling, he is the one who told this to Hitler. Hitler never thought about this. And the Germans, they had no plan whatsoever. They had made no war scenario in the Joint Chiefs in Germany, the Oberkommando in the Wehrmacht. They had no war scenario for taking Norway. In fact, they didn't have any updated maps about Norway. The maps they had of Norway was dating back from 1890. They found a few scraps in the cellar of some kind of army office. So when Falkenhorst, the German general, who was told to make the invasion plan in Norway, what he had to do first was go to a bookstore and buy himself a tourist guide to Norway. That was his document for planning the invasion of Norway, was that far-fetched, you know. But it was Quisling who convinced Hitler that Norway was more pro-Anglo, more pro-English than Hitler actually anticipated. He had this idea, said that there was a Germanic brotherhood, you know, that this would just fall into place. But Quisling told him, no, the Norwegians, they're positive, they're sympathetic to the English effort. You know, we had the first queen in Norway, she was English. So if you don't watch out, the English will take Norway, and most likely will do so with no significant opposition from Norway. That we would never know if Norway would have resisted an English invasion, but that was...
sounds unlikely, but it sounds more unlikely that we will resist an British invasion to me.
Pardon me?
It sounds unlikely that it would have that English resistance against the English would.
Yeah, it sounds unlikely, but at the same time, although Norway was, of course, this is because of the First World War, sympathetic and West-leaning. Before the First World War, Norway was definitely German-leaning. I mean, if you read Norwegian novels from the late 1900s, you will time and again, on a regular basis, run into German quotations. They would quote Goethe and Fichte and all these well-known German writers in German. It would be written in German language in Norwegian books because it was people simply could read German. But because of the First World War, and as you mentioned, Belgium was a huge issue, and the shock of the German army marching through neutral Belgium to take on France really made an impact in Norway. And after that, and of course, then you had 4 other more years, and you had a German submarine war, which affected Norwegian sailors and Norwegian shipping in at a massive rate. You know, a lot of Norwegian ships being sunk by German submarines. So the sympathy in Norway after 1918 was definitely towards England. That said, it's not necessarily that, I mean, if England had come, and they would have done so with no warning, the Norwegian government would have been given no warning. They would just have marched in. It's not said by itself that Norway would not have reacted to that. There might have been some kind of, not serious resistance, but there might have been some kind of symbolic resistance, a little bit shooting and so on, just to make the point we are neutral. We don't accept this. We're not placing ourselves on the English part. As a way of communicating to Germany, we want to stay neutral. We want to be out of this conflict. So if England had come, it might have happened with very little stress to them, you know, to march through Norway, but it would definitely have soured the relationship with Norway politically.
So of course, let's talk about and this is rather a significant date in Norwegian history, when 9th April, when the Nazis invaded. So how quickly was this done? Because the Norwegian, even with outdated weapons, they do manage to sink one of their ships as they drove into the Oslofjord.
Yeah, you had a coastal defense in Norway, which was well made. I mean, this is back. We had a war situation against Sweden from the late 1890s to 1905. But also the First World War was a wake-up for Norway. So although the guns were outdated, they did function, and most of the Norwegian defense at the eve of the German invasion, on April 9th, had a fairly miserable showing. I mean, you had army commanders who just gave up and put down their weapons, and you had this infamous situation where soldiers were giving defunct weapons, rifles, where parts of mechanism had been stored at different locations. And this was out of fear of a socialist revolution in Norway. So the Germans had a lot going for them when they came to Norway. They were, of course, a much more efficient war machine, and had been so for 100 years, because the Prussians had been building up a very well-functioning military organism. But what happened is that the invasion had not many, but a few major setbacks. First of all, there was one or two big ships sunk in the Skagerrak, during the crossing over from Denmark, and a lot of soldiers went down. This is not talked so much about in Norwegian history, but a lot of the troops that were supposed to land in southern Norway on April 9th, they went down. They drowned in the seas. But then the other more famous and very significant event is, of course, that at the small town of Drøbak, this major German warship, Blücher, was sunk by the local commander, who pretty much took things into his own hands. He acted according to what was the regulated way to act for an officer. I mean, you had an alien force coming in, and it was a bit confusion. Were they French? Were they Germans? Were they English? Some commanders thought they might be Italian. So you didn't really know if you should we fire on the English? That was a big thing. But this guy, he fired anyway. They'd be English or French or whatever they were. And accidentally, it turned out to be a German ship. And this was the ship holding the soldiers who were supposed to occupy Oslo, arrest the government, arrest the king, and do the same as in Denmark, within just hours, ensure that Norway politically was unable to put up a fight. But they couldn't do it.
I was forgot to say this, but it does kind of simultaneously with the occupation of Denmark. It kind of goes the same, just as quickly, maybe not as quickly, but it goes simultaneously as the occupation of Denmark, right?
That was the same operation. They took Denmark in the first hours, and they were just proceeded on to Norway. And of course, Denmark is a much more difficult country to defend. It's just totally flat. So once the Germans were on shore, there wasn't that much the Danish could do. Norway is, you'd have to admit, because of the topography, the mountains and just the geographical expanse, it's much more difficult to take quickly. And it did take the Germans 2 months to take it. First about 1 month to take southern Norway, and then the last month to take Narvik, this crucial port town in northern Norway, where the iron ore from northern Sweden were to be shipped out. So Denmark fell quickly, and also the king in Denmark didn't have much choice. He was put under,
house arrest.
In Copenhagen. The Germans had him under control, so that was about it. I mean, he could have chosen to become a martyr and die, but I mean, it kind of goes against the grain in Scandinavian mentality to do that. And you have to remember too that the Germans were very adamant that this would be presented as a mild occupation. They were very insistent. We come as friends. We're not interested in having war. We come to protect you against England. Maybe they didn't think that would go over so easily, but they had good reason to think that the local population in Denmark and Norway would not be too hostile. That was a wrong assessment in the long run, but it's understandable that the Germans thought so, because there'd been so much contact beforehand. And of course, when you're a Nazi, you're kind of blinded by your own ideology. But we should remember that these were still not the hardcore Nazis coming. This was the Wehrmacht, was the military officers. And what they did in Scandinavia is not particularly different from what they had done before in France in 1871 1870, 1871 in Belgium and during the First World War. They came in with a tremendously efficient war machine, hit strong to subdue the enemy, and then thought that the local population would just accept this as just another of those instances where the great powers do what they have to do. And there's not really much the local population can do to change, the power politics among the great powers. That was the idea, but and in a way they were right. But you had this Norwegian resistance for 2 months, of course.
So as the Nazis come in, how much time did the government, because unlike in Denmark, the Norwegian national is able to flee to England. So how much time does the government have to prepare to flee and take, not necessarily take everything they have, but to flee and escape the country?
Yeah, this happened at the spur of the moment. As I said, it's of course it's Nazi control, but the people, the soldiers landing, this is a whole different debate. But the kind of the Nazi component of the occupation in Norway, it comes to the forefront a few weeks later. When you have a political occupation of Norway. So it's still the Wehrmacht, but the government, they are woken up in the wee hours of April 9th. There's confusion everywhere. They're told that this warship has been sunk, the Blücher, and that the Germans are coming. So they establish fairly quickly that the attacking force is German. And thanks
Probably wouldn't be a good idea to stay.
Pardon?
Probably wouldn't be a good idea to stay.
It was but this is not something that Norwegians were prepared for. So it's the prime minister at the time, Johan Nygaardsvold. Of course, his reputation was completely ruined by these chaotic hours because he was caught into some kind of apathy, and he just didn't measure up to the situation. In my opinion, a bit unfair to say, because no Norwegians had been prepared for this. It's been a country at peace for more than 100 years. Of course, you should hope for the political leaders to rise to the occasion and so on, but very few in Europe did. But what you did have in Norway was a very quick-witted president of the parliament, Hambro, who was a conservative. The government in Norway at the time was a labor government. And this Hambro, he's the one who orchestrated the escape from Oslo. And I don't know how much they could pack, but it was a few underwear. And was it Nygaardsvold himself or Hambro? I can't remember, but I think Nygaardsvold, he was a big guy, he was a little bit overweight. And he wore underwear which was not regular sized, so he was very happy that he could pack at least his underwear, because it was very difficult to get hold of that big size underwear. So those kind of funny things that happen in a chaotic, confused situation like this. But it was the Germans were coming, and they just had to scramble out of Oslo, and by sheer luck, and the Germans went after that very aggressively, and they sent forward platoon to try to either arrest or kill the government and the king. And you had this skirmish outside of Elverum, which is in the vicinity of Oslo, but a few hours by train. But so chance was on the luck was on the Norwegian side, and the government and the king could escape, and then they had a whole tour through Norway up to northern Norway.
Why choose this route? Why not try to go westwards and then take a ship to London? Why go all the way north? Is there a logical reason for this?
Yeah, well, they were trying to hold the Germans as long as possible, and for a while there was an idea that the Germans will probably take southern Norway, but hopefully we can make a stand in northern Norway. So if they could get across kind of that front line, wherever that would be. The Germans, they were just going for Narvik. So because of Allied help, Polish and French and English troops being sent in massive quantity, and in Narvik, it seemed very. I mean, they retook Narvik because the Germans, they were weak up there. It was a fair assessment that Narvik could be held, and in that case, you could have a sort of a local government in the very northern part of Norway. And another alternative was that, which the crown prince, he was very much interested in. Okay, the government, the king, can go to England just to stay safe, but I'll stay back here and I'll function as the figurehead for Norwegian resistance, holding the Germans south of Narvik. But none of that came to effect, because when France fell and you had Dunkirk and everything, then the Allies just had to leave Norway and worry about their own countries.
Because as you mentioned, Narvik, there is, I think it was supposed to come on Christmas, but I don't know if the movie has come out yet, but there is supposed to be a movie coming out in Norway about the battle, which I'm not even sure has come out yet because of the C word. But it was essentially, I remember you writing this, it was an Allied victory, essentially, wasn't it?
Yeah, they were not decisively though, because the Germans, they retreated up into the mountains. But you have to remember that the Germans, these were paratroopers mainly. They came with the ships up there, but it was very limited how many troops they could transport. And to hold Narvik, you have to hold the vicinity around it. You have it's a challenging landscape to take. So towards the end of this battle, and you're now talking June 1940, you had something like between 20 and 30,000 Allied troops. The Norwegian soldiers fighting alongside these English, French, and Polish troops. And I think the kind of battle-ready German troops amounted to only like 700, something like that. So it was a totally uneven battle. And of course, if it had lasted, the Germans would have been defeated. And they were kind of positioning themselves for this, going into the mountains and not too far away from the border to Sweden, so that they could flee across into neutral Sweden should the Allies stay. But the Allies had to retreat, as mentioned. They just couldn't stay in Norway anymore. So there was that was a huge major disappointment to the Norwegian politicians and the Norwegian military. People crying, battle-hardened officers breaking down in tears and so on. But that was just the reality of the war at the time, that Norway itself ended up just being one of the many countries in the war, the theater of war. At the time when Hitler went after Norway, Norway was, Denmark fell easily. Norway was country number 2 after Poland to kind of put up a serious fight. But then when he launched his blitzkrieg into Western Europe, there wasn't much chance of Norway to hold their own territory.
So, of course, as the occupation begins, you do mention, and it's quite a significant airport today in Værnes, Trondheim Airport, but it looks quite different then. So what was the significant? Because you write quite a lot about it in your book, about how important Værnes as an airport is.
Yeah, but Trondheim, of course, Norway is a very long country, so ideally you should have had a map to point this out. You have Oslo in the very southern part of it, but the Germans, they have to take the major ports. They land troops all up through the coast. There are several places. Bergen is another big port you have to take, but many smaller towns too. But Værnes and Trondheim, which is in the middle of Norway, And I mean, that's typically, traditionally, that's where the capital would have been, in the heart of the country. That was crucial to the Germans because they needed to refuel the planes that were going up to Narvik. They didn't have bombers and transport planes with a long enough range. And this was a surprise to the Germans to discover how undeveloped the infrastructure in Norway was. And they were surprised, but also quite a bit disappointed. They thought these Norwegians would have shared the Germanic spirit and be equally industrious and entrepreneurial as the Germans were. But what they discovered was a country that didn't, simply between Oslo and north of Oslo, didn't have any decent airports at all. And outside of Trondheim, this crucial landing spot, they had an airport, Værnes, but it wasn't an airport like the Germans would have thought of it. That would have meant, concrete surfacing and so on. It was just a field that, when the rains came, turned into mud. And bombers and military aircraft are heavy stuff, so they were bogged down and they couldn't do it. So the Germans had to make one of those very impressive projects that they were experts on doing, just building an airport from scratch very, very quickly. So they did it first with wooden flooring, basically, and then after they had secured Narvik, they began to lay the concrete there. But it was very, very important to the Germans to take Trondheim. And later on in the war, this figured prominently for Hitler, because he thought of Trondheim to become this, a major naval base for the Germans, from where they could secure the North Atlantic. That was his. So he was having megalomaniac plans for to expand Trondheim into a city of 250,000 people, and it was going to be the Singapore of the North Europe and so on. So Trondheim was very important to the Germans from the very beginning.
That was quite a vision there.
Yeah, that would move the city a little bit, and this was, of course, to facilitate the submarine bunkers, But it was because of strategically, this is the North Atlantic, and he had to stop the Allied convoys going to Murmansk, because that's where Stalin got his supplies. The Black Sea and Vladivostok was not really something that Stalin could use, but he got shipments from the United States via England to Murmansk. So and that traffic went north of Norway. So they deployed the submarines in Trondheim and also further north in Norway to attack those convoys. So from a strategic point of view, Trondheim was very important.
Now, you also talk about how the Nazi occupation became like an economic boom and work opportunities for the Norwegian people. And as you read this, it does kind of like, doesn't sound too bad, right? But then you also read that they torture people and they imprison and the innocent people do, and that that sounds like the Nazis. So let's talk about before we come to the resistance part, as we were talking about how the economic boom and the Nazi occupation kind of helped in a way for the Norwegian people, giving work opportunities.
Yeah, of course, you have to put all these terms in quotation marks, because a kind of unanimous total assessment would, of course, be that the occupation was a bad thing. Nobody wants to be occupied by a foreign force, but the backdrop is, of course, the interwar years, and you have the economic crisis. The 20s and 30s, they were very hard all over Europe, all over the world, and Norway was no different. A lot of personal bankruptcies, and although this kind of ended in 1933, 1934, the worst of the crisis, the sense of economic distress lingered on. Of course, you had a labor government during the last half of the 1930s who emphasized, that the economic recovery has to benefit people.
Because we have to remember that Norway wasn't this famous welfare state we are today until the late 70s. It was still a poor country, like most countries in Europe at the time.
Yeah, and people suffered. So you had a massive problem of unemployment among young men. This is also, I think, is a significant aspect to how the German occupation and all these German building projects affected the population, because the demographic kind of group that benefited the most from them were young men, and you had very high percentage of the Norwegian population at the time. They were youngsters, young men and women in the age of between 15 and 30 years old. You had a sort of baby boom around 1920, and they were now coming of age. And a lot of those men and women, of course, but mainly it's a concern for the men, they were unemployed. They had rather pathetic lives. They didn't have any prospects to marry. They were staying at home. Things were
that sounds like my life right now.
Yeah, well, but at least you live in the welfare state, as you say. And then in come the Germans, and nobody is happy about this, of course. But people are really kind of sitting on the fence a bit, wondering how this is going to play out. It's important to remember, a small country like Norway, the mentality is that there is not very much we can do when the great powers go to war against each other. When England and Germany have a clash, we can't do much else than just sit around, wait for this cataclysmic event to pass over. And in the meantime, we have to live, we have to make money, and so on.
There's a famous meme where I don't know if you've seen it, but it's where like Britain was alone in World War II, at least in the beginning, and then you see also Britain, and it's still this huge British Empire.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, memes are not my
fair enough.
Interest. Bit too old for that. But you have all these young men, particularly, who want work. And what the Germans do, like they have to fix up the Norwegian infrastructure. It's just a total mess. They come in and they don't find any roads they can use. There aren't any ports that can take in big cargo ships, warships, and so on. They don't have airports. All these things have to be built up, and they're shipping up a lot of soldiers. I mean, it takes 2 months and you have 100,000 German soldiers, and they need to be accommodated. They need barracks to stay in. They need camps. So there's even as the war in Norway is proceeding, the battle between the Germans and the Norwegian forces, you have a lot of Norwegians being kind of forced out, but also seeking out employment with the Germans. And it sounds shocking because of the image we have of the Nazis later on, but we have to remember that the image we have of the German occupation force is kind of a post-1945 image. I mean, the Germans who come in 1940, they have a different image. Nobody really knows that these are the people who is going to perpetrate the Holocaust. We don't really know them as torturists anymore. The Gestapo, all this stuff is to come later on. They're just German soldiers. It's the German army. And like we don't have, but the religious leader in Norway at the time, he was the bishop in Oslo. He makes a big point out of this, that, okay, we have a war, but if we lose, we have to kind of be good sports about it. And let's remember that the Germans, they behave kind of nicely to us. I mean, and they did so. The Germans were very clear to the German generals were instructing their soldiers to behave nicely against the Norwegians, respectfully and so on, not to steal anything. So working for the Germans in 1940 was something totally different than working for the Germans, say, if you consider that issue in 1946 or the fall of 45, because in that case, it would have meant working for the, these crazy Nazis who went through with the Holocaust, who was laying Europe barren. But in 1940, it seemed just like any other kind of occupying force. So a lot of young men, they get work, and what the Germans do to lure people into working for them is, of course, they print money. So they pay very well. You work for the Germans, you get much better paid than working for a Norwegian company. So this is, if not necessarily popular, I mean, you can just keep your mouth shut and work for the Germans, and you will make a lot of money. And you can then have much better prospects asking that girl that you're interested in to marry. You might be able to buy an apartment. You may be able to have a life for yourself. And if you're pushing 30 and nothing of that has happened before, that's quite an incentive for a young man to take a job. You work for a few months at some kind of German project. Why worry about it? This can kind of save your life.
And of course, we have to talk about, because as you know, of course, Quisling will be the first kind of to do a coup d'etat through the radio, and mentioned he would be the first to broadcast that this has been a new government. We are the new Nazi government now. So we have to talk about his government too, of course, and how well does it do as prime minister of Norway?
To begin with, he does horribly, of course, and this is a big headache for the Germans. Same thing happens other places in Europe, most importantly in Holland. You also have a kind of Quisling character there. Musart is have his fascist party, and he insists, give Holland to me and I'll rule it, and we'll do this according to the German needs, and we'll form some kind of Nazi union in Europe. The problem is that, of course, these local Nazi parties, Quisling's party in Norway and Musart in Holland, they have no basis for their authority. There's no popular support for them. So they become just a burden to the German occupation because they are so unpopular and quickly become so hated. So Quisling, he makes this coup d'etat in the radio, and his first government, it lasts like 6 days or something. And the Germans, the German generals, they tell Hitler, you have to get rid of him. We have to make some other arrangement because he is hampering the German war effort. We can't occupy Norway with this guy. He's just too hated. The Norwegians, we can talk to them. They can deal with the Wehrmacht, but they can't deal with Quisling. It's out of the question. So very quickly, Hitler sends up one of his old buddies from the Nazi party, Josef Terboven, who was a Gauleiter, the local Nazi leader in Essen, is it? The industrial area, west in Germany. And he's old school Nazi, very hardcore, and he tries to take establish relations with the Norwegians at first, and he sees that Quisling is just hopeless. He has no respect for Quisling.
You do theorize, and has this been? I wonder if this has been supported that he does have Asperger's, as we call it today. Is there truth to this that he does?
Well, that's a Quisling, not.
That's what I was referring to. Yeah, that Quisling does have Asperger's. Is there truth
well,
to this?
it's not my words, but there's Hans Fredrik Dahl, who is kind of the leading Quisling biographer in Norway. When he reissued his biography, he wrote his biography in the 90s, and it was reissued as a single volume, not maybe 10 years ago, I can't remember when, but then he put in this information from a psychiatrist, And Quisling, of course, he was a very bizarre character. Um, Very competent in his own way. He was number one at the War Academy, the Officers Academy, when he took his officer training. But he was equal to Hitler, completely incapable of forming and maintaining human relations. He had no personal relations with anybody. He never smiled. He had this kind of stony expression on himself, no humor whatsoever. So I don't know, it might be fair to those who have this Asperger diagnosis, but there are many suggestions that he might have had it. And also this very unmovable ideological view of things that he knows best. But at the same time, that's Nazi mentality. That's what the Nazis were. I mean, Quisling, he wrote his political program in 1933. It was one page. It wasn't very, not complicated at all. But that was the standard Nazi thing. And it was not supposed to be changed. So he never changed it. There was one program, and this is what we go for. So, yeah, I don't know. It might make sense that he was that he had some kind of diagnosis, but the point is that politically he was so unpopular. He was representing a policy which was very alien to the Norwegian population at the time. Norway had become a liberal democracy with strong hints now of a welfare, at least ambitions of a welfare state. And here come the Nazis, and they want to take away all these democratic rights that, like, workers have been fighting very hard to get for the past 50 years or so. So nobody in Norway thought that Quisling had any answers to how the country should be run. And Terboven, when he gets underway with his Reichskommissariat, what he wants to do is to form some kind of collaboration with the political community in Norway. He wants to maintain the parliament, and he wants the parliament to form some kind of coalition government that Terboven can work together with. This Riksråd, it's called in Norwegian, sort of, not politically, because it's not going to be
War
a
council,
democracy.
perhaps.
Pardon?
War council, perhaps directly.
Yeah, something like that. But of course, this there's not going to be a war anymore. Norway will capitulate, and you're going to have a peaceful occupation, and you have to have an efficient administering of Norwegian society that aids the war effort, the German war effort on other fronts. So he doesn't want there to be a war situation. It's going to be a Germanic, Nordic, brotherhood of people, where the Norwegians understand that collaborating with Terboven and the German regime is to their own good, So the problem is that, of course, when they do this, and the Norwegian parliament, they're about to go along with what Terboven demands. The problem is that for some strange reason, Terboven makes a wrong turn at the very end of these negotiations, and he demands that the Nazi party in Norway, Quisling's party, will be guaranteed so and so many ministerial posts. And this is absolutely no-go for the Norwegian government, or the Norwegian parliamentarians, the politicians. Quisling is hated at that rate, so they just flatly say no. And being a Nazi, being very well
it doesn't come off well.
Yeah, with the Nazi way of doing things, then Terboven just makes a clean cut on it. He says, okay, then we ban all political parties, we close down the parliament, and we let Quisling have his way. He can form this one-party Nazi government in Norway. And of course, the reason why Terboven says that is not because he thinks Quisling is able to do anything, but it is because Quisling has Hitler's ear. Hitler likes Quisling, and he's not interested in going into the details of how things work in Norway. But Terboven basically has to accept that Quisling is at the Führer's favor. So he is given the right to form this government. And Quisling does so, and they try to, he has hopes that Norway will be Nazified, that the Norwegian population will understand that the Nazi rule is the way to the future. But it's the remaining 5 years of government is uphill struggle all the way. He never gets a hang of the Norwegian population. Of course, it moves fairly well. There's a lot of people enter into the Nazi party, Quisling's party, because they need to do so. Partially also a lot of people, we have to accept this fact that they think the Nazis will be the way to the future. In 1940, 1941, it does seem like Hitler is about to win the war, but then after the warlike changes with the Battle of Stalingrad and so on, it becomes increasingly difficult to be a Nazi figure in Norway. So, and also there's a lot of internal strife among the Nazis, in Quisling's own party. It's not like this is a party which has one unanimous voice about how things should be done. You have various factions who end up coming to at head with each other at several points in the occupation years.
Now, Himmler as well is really fascinated by Norway, and he's trying to recruit to SS and Gestapo in Norway. And according to the Nazis, and I believe Hitler himself, he says that Norwegians is the ideal Aryan race. So why does it think that Norwegians are the Aryan race, and what is the fascination of recruiting Norwegian soldiers to the SS, and which was quite a few joined up, as we are going to talk about in Operation Barbarossa. What is it about the Norwegian fascination amongst the Nazis that they are this ideal Aryan race?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Nazis, they use various terms for this. They call it the Aryan race, but of course at the time they think the Indians and the Persians, they're also Aryans. So it's not the Aryan race hails from Tibet originally, so they have to be more specific. And then they have this idea, they call it the Germanic races. But what is the German? You find the Germanic people all over Europe, as history shows. So in order to make it even more specific, they also use this term, the Nordic race. And this is essential to Hitler's thinking, because of course he was a uncompromising anti-Semite, but that was not the way he started out. Before 1918, before the 1920s, Hitler was much more of just a racist, generally speaking. He didn't like this multicultural state in Austria, the Habsburgian Empire, that he had been born into. He hated that stuff. He hated the Czechs, for example. He was really adverse to the, you had people in Austria speaking Czech language, stuff like that he really hated. So the idea of the Nordic races appealed very much to him. And they used this interchangeably with the Germanic races. And what this was an idea that you had a racially pure segment of the European population centered in Germany, but mainly Northern Europe. So you had the Germans, you had the Dutch, they were Germanic. You had part of the Belgians, the Flemish speaking in Belgium. The French, not so much. You had the Germans, they could make allowances for some northern French, part of the northern French population, and they did recruit, SS soldiers from there. But it was mainly Dutch, Danish, Swedes. They were into the Swedes too, of course, and then Norwegians. And the reason why
was Swedish, of course.
Pardon?
Bjørn's wife was Swedish.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pro-German attitudes. I mean, in Norway we have easy access to England. It's just across the ocean. But Sweden traditionally has been more east and southern leaning. So there was a connection between Germany and Sweden even during the war. But of course, what they had was this idea that the Nordic race had been maintained in the most pure fashion in the Scandinavian countries, and no place more so than in Norway. This partly due to the Viking era, but they had this kind of mysterious mystique is very important to a Nazi frame of mind. They had this kind of idea of a mysterious cult or origin of racially pure people in Norway. So Himmler, he was very curious about Norway. He early on in the war, he made a few journeys there. He came often during the spring of 1941, partly because he wanted to establish Waffen-SS recruitment. He wanted soldiers from Norway to assist in the planned attack on the Soviet Union. But the reason why he wanted soldiers from Norway was not because they were considered to be militarily necessary. What he needed them for was to create a kind of a racial elite in the future of Greater Germania, which would be occupied Europe. The SS would be, he envisioned the SS to be the backbone, the racial backbone of this Germanic empire, the Thousand-Year Reich in the future. And to do so, if he could induce Norwegians to become part of this SS organism, that would just strengthen the racial quality in the SS. And the technicalities of this is very difficult to explain. They had a lot of scientists who wrote voluminous dissertations about this, but it boils down to this mysterious ideology of there being some kind of a racial core, a Nordic, Germanic, Aryan racial core, which was the most pure in Norway. So that's also why he wanted Norwegian women to marry German SS soldiers to breed, basically.
And there is actually quite a few women who does this, that they not necessarily marry, but become Nazi girlfriends, as well we'll talk about after the war.
Yeah, there are quite a few. Of course, you have to separate. You have this the general kind of association between German soldiers and Norwegian women, which could just be, there's a platoon of 30 German soldiers come to some kind of small town or an isolated provincial area, and there just aren't that many other men, and the Germans come across as very handsome, dashing, nice uniforms and so on, and just normal interpersonal relations that develop. The SS effort is a totally different thing. That is a planned and orchestrated effort to secure genetic purification of the future of the Nazi regime in Europe. That German SS soldiers, not Wehrmacht soldiers, but German SS soldiers will be kind of coupled with Norwegian pure blood women, and they should just have as many babies as possible in order to secure the future of Germania.
Now, of course, this brings us to the next topic, which is, as we know, he does invade the Soviet Union, and there is some dedicate a little part of this new book as well. The Norwegian soldiers that do join the SS, how did they behave, and how well did they do in Operation Barbarossa when they're being sent to the East Front?
Well, in total, there's about 5,000, I think. Norwegians who end up enrolling into the Waffen-SS. This is the military branch of the SS. I mean, SS under Himmler started out as just the German police force. Himmler, soon after 1933, he took control over the German police and fused it with the SS organization. So in order to be a German police officer, you had to become an SS member. And the Norwegian police also was put under the control of SS men. That was sort of the branch of SS with the task of controlling already occupied territory, or the domestic areas. Now, when they went into Soviet Union, they needed also a military branch, and that became the Waffen, the armed unit of the SS. And this is where the Norwegians were kind of volunteered, because they would only accept volunteers. The SS, the entire SS, the Waffen SS, consisted of volunteer personnel. They wanted people who were ideologically motivated. So that in itself says that the Norwegians who volunteered for the SS, these 5,000 men, in aftermath, what they tried to do, the survivors, they really tried to kind of portray themselves mainly as anti-Stalinists. They were against the Bolsheviks, but they would never have been accepted into the SS unless they were ideologically convinced Nazis. This is very important. And they were, of course, they got military training, and they were sent to Germany to training camps, but a substantial part of that training was ideological. They were ideologically indoctrinated with the SS worldview, the Weltanschauung of the SS. So these were, convinced Nazis when they went into the Soviet Union. And the Norwegians, they went in first. They were sent down through Ukraine. The details of it, this is a war situation, so we have to accept that we will not have final answers about what they did there and so on. But we know that they followed in the wake of the German war effort designed to just annihilate the Soviet population, and fairly soon the Jewish population in the Ukraine. And the Norwegians, as long as they are part of the SS, that means, and they're not being shipped back or executed or something like that, that means they're doing their job, the way the Waffen SS leaders want them to do it. So that means going all along, full-blown, following the procedure, with all that which that entails of attacks on the civilian and the military population in the former Soviet Union. So there's no difference between being a Norwegian Waffen SS and being a German Waffen SS or Dutch Waffen SS or anything like that. These Norwegians, 5,000 is that's a big number. This is of course the war all seen on the one, but there's no reason to think that they were in any substantial way different or milder in their conduct than the German soldiers themselves.
Now, of course, way up in the north, we got a town called Finnmark, and the Nazis did bomb quite a few cities in Norway, but this one is kind of significant. And we are going to talk about this now, because the bombing of Finnmark, and there was a reason behind this. And as you talk about in your book, again, you do mention that the fear of Norway becoming Soviet state. What was how real was this threat threat that the Norwegian become a communist state under Soviet Union post World War II?
Well, becoming a Soviet state, not very, the risk for that was not very big. But of course, as the war continues, and then Hitler makes this amazing blunder that he declares war on the United States. I mean, within half a year, he does two major idiotic things. He goes to war against the Soviet Union, and then he goes declares war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, which essentially guarantees he's going to lose the war. There's no way he's going to be able to win against those two. But then you have an ally group consisting of England, which is now the baby brother. You know, they're not a very strong partner in this troika of countries. And then you have the United States, and you have the Soviet Union, and you have Roosevelt and Stalin. And they discuss, when you get into 42, 43, 44, they discuss how post-World War II Europe will look like. And they put up various scenarios, because Stalin is very clear. He wants his sphere of influence. And the Western two countries, the United States, the Americans, they kind of had, by the World War, ensures that they breaking out of their isolationist stance. Because before Hitler went on his rampage, you know, in the United States, the political community is most inclined to just stay out of everything, let the Europeans battle it out. But now Americans too, they think they need to control the post-World War. And in fact, in one of those plans they put up, I can't remember exactly when it was, I think sometime in 1943, Norway is placed within the Stalin's sphere of influence. Because Stalin has always been a weak point of Russian military strategic situation, or however you want to put it, that they don't have any ports. They only have Vladivostok in the east, they have the Black Sea Fleet, and then they have Murmansk, you know, on the Kola Peninsula, which allows them access to ice-free waters. So the Russians, they really would have liked to have access to especially the coastal areas in northern Norway. But this never materializes into something very serious. Norway stays firmly within the Western sphere of influence during the war. Not necessarily that we can, people would know that. And when you follow the war from Norway during those occupational years, you know, 1940 to 45, of course, the press is Nazi control. Under Nazi control, there's a censorship. But what they write about is the Eastern Front. The interest is towards what goes on in between Germany and the Soviet Union. After the war, emphasis is much more on the Western Front and the landing in Normandy, and you know, the SOE, the sabotage groups coming from England and so on. But during the war, the main concern is what is going on in Soviet Union and in the Finnish theater, not the least. How the war in Finland is playing out. And when we get towards the end of the war, 1944, 45, you mentioned Finnmark, and of course, Finnmark is the first part of Norway to be liberated by Soviet troops. But what is happening there is that the Germans are first retreating out of Finland. They're moving north, and they're burning Finland north of, in the northern part, in Lapland. They're beginning the scorched earth tactic in Finland, then moving into Norway, and they just continue doing the same thing there, burning everything and forcibly evacuating the local population down towards further south in Norway, to just leave a barren country that the Soviet soldiers cannot kind of survive on, to keep the Soviet Union out of Finnmark.
kind of trying to ask the same question again because, yeah, as you say, how likely would it be been that the Soviet Union would have kept northern Norway after the
No,
liberation?
well, obviously, in retrospect, in hindsight, what we know now, not very likely. Stalin obviously didn't consider it crucial, or what his considerations were, I don't know. He might have thought it would have created too much conflict with the allies, with the Western allies. But he was there. He had soldiers in Finnmark, Ukrainian soldiers, if I'm not mistaken, quite a few of them. They pushed out the Germans. They were there, but they stopped quite far east in Finnmark, and they never showed any ambition to proceed. So Stalin, when you get towards the end of the war, and now you're talking late 1944, 45, thought that England can take Norway. So he allowed English troops to be the first to enter into, to sort of handle the post-war phase in Norway. In hindsight, you can say Norway was not really under risk. Of course, if Stalin had thought differently, he would not have thought twice about taking northern Norway, because look at what he did in Finland, this massive operation he did there in 1939 to have Finland. But Norway was obviously not, he was satisfied with having his part of East Europe, and Poland and Czechoslovakia and the Baltic states would be very important to him, but not northern Norway.
So of course we haven't touched upon this, but and this brings us to the next part, which is the Jewish, and I put in quotation, the Jewish problem. So how was this dealt with? There was actually quite a few Jews in Norway at the time of the Nazi occupation.
I don't know, not many. It's 2,000, something like that, 2,500. I can't remember exactly. And the Jewish population in Norway didn't have a long history. There might be like grandchildren. You could have 3 generations living here. The first of them came. They came from East Europe. The former Soviet, or the former Tsarist Russia. They had fled the pogroms there, some from the Baltic states. But that was not different from Germany in itself. The Jews in Germany were not a big minority. They were a very small part of the population. And still they were considered dangerous enough that they had to be exterminated. The Germans, they move against the Jews very soon after they come to Norway. Still, while the fighting is going on, in May 1940, I believe, they confiscate radio apparatuses owned by Jews. So they have a clear anti-Semitic attitude. But of course, the Holocaust in Norway, as well as in the rest of Europe, is a fairly improvised thing. It happens very quickly in 1942. It's a consequence of things not going Hitler's way in the Soviet Union. Barbarossa is not moving, is not succeeding the way he's hoping for, and by this time he's a convinced anti-Semite, and Nazi ideology explains all ills in the world. It be the capitalist world or the Bolshevik world. This is a kind of insoluble paradox of Nazi mentality, that they could blame Bolshevism and free market capitalism both on the Jewish population. But that's how they did it. When things are not moving according to Hitler's plan in the Soviet Union, he thinks that by exterminating, removing the European Jewish population, that is one of the crucial things he needs to do in order to get a grasp around the conflict, to move the war into the direction where he wants it to move. So, I mean, the final solution is decided upon sometime in the late winter of 1942, February, when you have the Wannsee conference, can't remember exactly when. The deportations in Europe begin in the summer of 1942. And due to certain events of military events in Norway, it explodes in Norway in the fall, October, November 1942. That's when the Holocaust comes to Norway. It's been, of course, part of the plan all along, but it's some local, the local situation dictates why it's happening. And as with many things in the Nazi way of doing it, it's a partly planned, but also partly just improvised operation. They do it on the spur of the moment. Now we have the window of opportunity. We need to use it now. So.
Now, the way I understood it, they do seem to be able to get all the Jews out and sent to concentration camps, various places around Europe. So you do mention this as well. How many does come back alive and back to Norway after the war?
The exact number of how many comes back, I don't know. They deport 773 people. And this is not a big shipment. You have to remember that they have a lot of experiencing deportations at this time. 773 people would just be a minor city, you know, in for example, Austria. That what they deport from Vienna and Berlin and so on is populations of greater size than that. So this is not a big operation for the Germans at all. But they deport 773 people, and they go straight to Auschwitz, and they're being gassed immediately upon arrival. How many return? I don't know, but it's just a handful. They take out a few men for camp service, but the vast majority, they're killed instantly.
And of course, before we go on to the post-war years and after World War II, we have to talk about, of course, and this is an episode in itself. And if you watch it, I don't know if you are, but if you watch Norwegian cinema, this is quite a popular topic. No doubt, the Norwegian Resistance. There's quite a few handful of movies made about this, of course, and we have. So, how significant was the Norwegian Resistance to Nazi occupation?
Yeah.
Of course, we have to mention the sinking of the ship Donau as well, of course.
Yeah, well, the Donau is the ship that transported the Jews to Poland. From there, they go by train to Auschwitz. But the Norwegian resistance is not surprising that it is figures prominently in kind of the national self-image of Norway. All nations need heroes. And you have the military, the organized military resistance in 1940, which goes on for 2 months, which is kind of at first in shambles, but then it's built up and becomes fairly organized. You have some strong leaders. You have this General Otto Ruge who is conducting it and is very determined to fight the Germans. But after the Allies leave Narvik, there's not much alternative but kind of capitulating. So at that time, the Norwegian officers, they have to give their word of honor that they will not fight against Germany later on. So this is something that sounds a little bit strange to us, but it was common to do this. It's kind of this gentlemanly officers' approach to war, that you need to have rules to abide by. You can't just have war in a state of anarchy. So when we are defeated, we accept it and we say we're not going to fight against the Germans later on. This creates a problem, because when the war luck changes and there is a sense that Germany might lose the war, and that happens. Not many Norwegians, they walk around since 1940, thinking it's just a question of time when the Allies come and Germany will lose. So you have all these officers who then have committed themselves not to fighting, and they have put themselves effectively out of the resistance. What happens later on is that, of course, you have a civilian resistance in the wake of Quisling being named the prime minister, essentially prime minister of Norway in September 1940. This is a turning point because the civilian society in Norway is not prepared to accept him. So you have the buildup of a civilian resistance movement. Slowly but surely, there's a military resistance movement as well. You have officers who defy this code of honor, but you also have the government, which has by now escaped Norway and established itself in London. They build up a Ministry of Defense, and they have a military organization in London. And in the early 1942, they come in contact with a military, kind of the precursor of the a military resistance movement in Norway. And this military resistance, kind of the mainstream resistance movement in Norway, they don't do much until you get towards the very last phase of the war. And you're talking then the last 10, 12 months, you know. May 1944, they launched some bomb attacks against recruitment offices that the Germans have. And for the next 12 months, they have a fairly high level of activity. They're going after train transportations, you know, infrastructure and so on. But it's at the very end of the war. You have this, the local military kind of organization in Norway. In addition, you have these Norwegian soldiers, volunteers who have gone to England to join the English military, but they're put under control by the Norwegians. So there's a lot of wrangling back and forth, you know, who's going to decide their operations in Norway. But they're saboteurs, you know, like elite soldiers, paratroopers, and so on. And when we talked about the Waffen SS amounting to 5,000 men earlier on, what you have in England is during the war 500. So you know, in the ones who are going to entering into the Waffen SS, about 10 times as many. And these SOE, Special Operations Executive Soldiers, sort of they become, in the popular mind, the most active. They do some very they perform some sabotage operations which get a lot of attention. They bomb you know, German installations, and importantly they attack the economic resources of the Germans in Norway, you know, mines not least, because Norway has a lot of minerals. So you have those, you have two groups so far. You have the military resistance in Norway, then you have these Scotland-based SOEs, and then in addition you have communist resistant groups in Norway. You have two actually. You have one in Finnmark, you know, these partisans who are being shipped in from the Soviet military, and then you have a resistance group more based in southern Norway, run by a communist who stands under the orders of the Soviet secret police, as a matter of fact, NKVD. And this group, the Oswald group, is active from, they make the first efforts already in 1941, but from 1942 to 1944, they're very active. And been talked much less about in the post-war years in Norway, mainly because they were communists. But they this guy, the leader, he was much more adamant in his resistance, and that the Germans could only be fought against by military means. So you had a kind of multifaceted resistance movement, military resistance in Norway at the time.
So of course, as we know, we're going to move to after war. As we know, Hitler loses, and how does the occupation process work, and how the Nazi trials in Norway?
Yeah, well, what you have is some of those German leaders, they either shoot themselves, like the Reichskommissar Terboven, he shoots himself, and a few others, prominent SS leaders. The occupation is, we mentioned previously that what attacks Norway is not the kind of Nazi party as such, is the Wehrmacht, is the German military. But because of the way things develop for Hitler, with the that he gets bogged down in the Soviet Union, the occupation of Norway is placed under the Nazi party, but the SS gets a very strong role in the occupation of Norway, and these are just you know, red glowing Nazis. So quite a few of them, they kill themselves. In addition, of course, you have the Norwegian part of the occupation. It's important to remember we have two occupational regimes in Norway. You have the Germans, but you also have Quisling and his organization. And his Nazi party becomes very big if at the top of it, he has 40,000 members. So after the war, when it's become time to make a reckoning with the occupation, there's just an immense number of people who are indicted in Norway. 90,000 people are put on trial, or at least get cases put against them for treason. You know, and that's
among those arrested, if I remember correctly, is the Norwegian writer Knut Hamsun for being kind of a Nazi. It's not really Nazi, but you know, not pro-Nazi.
Oh yeah, he was politically. Hamsun was Nazi. I mean, you, of course, if you want to be very apologetic about it, you can say, oh, he was an old man, and what he really cared about was, you know, the cultural bond between Norway and Germany. But this is a guy, he's not dement or anything like that. He's very old at the time, way up in his 80s. But he knows what's going on. He knows Norway is being occupied. He has followed Hitler from the 1930s on. So he knows what the Nazi ideology is all about. And the Nazis, the Germans love. I mean, Alfred Rosenberg, he kind of the chief ideologue of the Nazi party in Germany. He writes a book which is called The Myth of the 20th Century, where he attempts to explain kind of the cultural and the sort of philosophical racial state of Europe, how it has developed world historically. It's a work which is kind of bizarre to read, but it's immensely wide in scope. And in that book, he says that, the Nazis, Hitler thought of himself as an artist. They had this kind of romanticist idea of themselves. They were kind of in touch with mysterious forces in nature. They had to be geniuses. They couldn't really be explained why they did the politics they did. They just knew that it's going to work. And Hamsun, he is the writer which more than anything is able to kind of express this. So Rosenberg says that there's only one writer, who's really expressing the force of the power of the will today in Europe, and that is Knut Hamsun. So Hamsun, all the German soldiers who came to Norway, at least vast majority of them, had read Hamsun or had his book along with him. So Hamsun, he is also the post-occupational regime in Norway, they go after Hamsun along with everybody else. But it's very difficult to admit that this great writer who Norwegians have been adoring, idolizing for so long, was a Nazi. So they make they kind of take a cheap way out of it, and they say, no, he is really dement. That's the reason why he loved the Nazis. So they say that he has weakened intellectual abilities. And of course, Hamsun's response to that is furious, right? And he ends up writing his last book, 100 pages long, which is one of the best books he wrote. He wrote his best books at the very beginning and the very end of his career, effectively proving that he was anything but dement or mentally, retarded. But for the rest of these Nazi party members, which Hamsun was never a member of the party, so they couldn't take him on that. But all the other members, and as I said, 90,000 in a population of 3 million is a huge number, were prosecuted with a vengeance. But typically this is the kind of the atmosphere, the mood subsided. So the most death penalties were decided upon in the fall of 45, 46. But as the war became more and more distant, the verdicts became increasingly milder. So Norway was a country which really had among the highest percentage of people put on trial for Nazi collaboration and treason.
Of course, something we have to, we were talking about this earlier, and in quotation, Nazi girls that were, how were they treated after the war? Because it wasn't very nicely.
No, they were not treated nicely. It's typical of any occupation, you know. You have an intriguing parallel in Iceland after the war, because the Americans, they of course wanted Iceland as a military base, so they stationed a lot of troops in and around Keflavik, the airport. And you have sort of a similar animosity towards Icelandic girls dating American soldiers in Iceland, actually. Of course, not nearly as violent as it became in Norway and other occupied countries, but this kind of the male society's feeling of entitlement, that we are entitled to control the sexuality and the social life of our women, is prevalent in just about any society. And Norway wasn't very different. And I think, I mean, there's estimated around 10. It's difficult to say exactly how many women dated German soldiers, but it might have been as many as more than 100,000. You have more than 10,000 children being born after the war, I think. So this was a widespread phenomenon, and they were gone after with horrible means. You had all these techniques of humiliation, you know. Some were stripped naked, but that wasn't very common in Norway. What the kind of and these were young men going after that. What they would do is, of course, shave their hair, so they would be visibly for anyone to see that this was a young girl who had been dating some German. And again, the mood was the most virulent in the immediate aftermath of the war, you know, May, June, summer months of 1945, before it gradually subsided. But those who had become pregnant and had given birth to children, those children were branded, you know, German children. And it's just a very sad aspect of recent Norwegian history, the utter lack of, you know, inclination, will in the society.
Barbarity.
Pardon?
Barbarity.
Yeah, well, you can say barbarity, but it's yeah, whichever term you want to use for it. At the same time, sitting in 2022 and moralizing about reactions, you have to remember that the occupation was a tough one on Norwegians. One thing is that, of course, you had rationing, you had hunger and all these kind of things, but there were a lot of Norwegians who ended up being arrested and experiencing German
violence.
Just a second.
No worries.
German, they were put in German prisons and so on. So you had a lot of hard feelings, and so it's not surprising at all that you'd have some kind of reaction towards those who were considered to be collaborating with the Germans. It would have happened in any place.
Thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure to have you on. Before you go, do you have anything you want to promote, and links you wish me to put in the description below?
My pleasure. Thank you.
My name is Erlend. This has been about H12. We are available every Thursday. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts these days. Please, if you have an iPhone, please consider writing us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. That would help us out a lot. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.